class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 39 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Winnipeg Jets, in which the Sharks have lost 2-1. And so this does indeed mark the 10th straight loss for the San Jose Sharks, the second time this season in which they've had a double-digit losing streak, and we are not even halfway through the year just yet. At the very least, if you want to take a look at the bright side, the Sharks opened the season with 11 straight losses, and pretty much through all 11 of those games, the Sharks had very little chance of ever actually winning any of them, besides maybe like one or two just based off of their goaltending. At the very least this time around, and during the ongoing 10-game losing streak, there have been a couple of competitive games sprinkled in here or there. In particular, you could just take a look at the one the other night against the Detroit Red Wings, or the game here tonight indeed against the Winnipeg Jets. While unlike the previous one, I don't think the Sharks were the better team on the night, I will give that edge to the Jets here. I do think if the Sharks had that extra bounce here or there, something that they really haven't had over these last couple of weeks, they definitely could have at the very least forced an overtime, if not perhaps even won this game completely. And so it's one that you could say in a way got away from San Jose, but is at the very least made it somewhat of an interesting game to watch anyhow. In the first period is really where the Sharks did struggle. This was the moment of the game in which it was not particularly competitive at all, as the Jets just had tons and tons of zone time. They were just rolling four lines, shift after shift in the offensive zone for themselves, and the Sharks were absolutely getting dominated. And yet, through those first 15 minutes where it was literally all Winnipeg, the game remained tied at 0 thanks to some heroics from Mackenzie Blackwood. And it came to the last 5 minutes of the first period where the Sharks started to wake up, strung together a couple of good shifts for themselves to give them a bit of momentum heading into the second period. Now, this first period was kind of reminiscent to one from a few games ago against the Edmonton Oilers, another one in which the Sharks were just not ready to play for that particular night. And in that game, the Sharks ended up giving up 4 goals in that opening period, partially because they had rookie goaltender Magnus Krona. And in my review of that game, I mentioned how with better goaltending, the Sharks likely would have been able to leave that first period with a slightly better looking deficit to perhaps give themselves a chance in the next couple of periods. And this is kind of what we saw here tonight. I think maybe the heroics of Blackwood was perhaps not super reproducible. This could have definitely been a game that was like 1-0 or perhaps 2-0 Winnipeg Jets by the end of the first period, but because they got that really good goaltending, the Sharks gave themselves a chance to come back in the last couple of periods of this game, and that they did. The second period was a lot more even. The Sharks looked quite good, evened it up in terms of shots, and even scored the first goal of this game coming from Barabanov as a Sharks power play expired to make it 1-0 San Jose. Unfortunately, that lead would be relatively short-lived as Barron would tie it up for the Jets, and that would be the score heading into the third period, a game tied at 1. In the previous matchup between these two teams, it was the Sharks just barely getting the victory over the Jets by a 2-1 score. Here tonight, it is the opposite, as it is Gabe Vilardi, as you guessed it, a power play goal as the Sharks' penalty kill continues to fail them, and it is a 2-1 victory for the Winnipeg Jets. Now, this is a 2-1 lead that does hold until the last a couple of minutes, of course, as the Sharks will look to get the goaltender out. But as with the previous night, the Sharks not exactly getting a lot rolling with the extra attacker, except one potential chance, that one coming off the stick of William Eklund. Now, I do want to take a bit of a tangent here, is that over the first couple of seasons in which Eklund was with the San Jose Sharks organization, he played a small handful of games in each of those first 2 years, around 7 or 8 games in both of those 2 years. And the major thing that the Sharks coaching staff seemed to want to instill in Eklund was that he needed to be more selfish with the puck, that he needed to shoot more. And coming into this season, Eklund seems to have taken that advice to heart, and he seems to be shooting a lot more thus far. However, it feels as though he has sometimes even gone a bit too far in that regard, and even ends up shooting in opportunities where it would be better to pass. And that was something that I have noticed thus far through the first couple of months, and if I have noticed it, perhaps someone within the Sharks organization with more power than me to actually make something happen would have noticed it as well, which makes me wonder if what we saw here tonight with Eklund passing up a glorious opportunity to shoot, instead looking for a very low percentage pass, could have perhaps had some something to do with that. Something that Eklund has been a lot more selfish in terms of being able to shoot this season, and perhaps there was some sort of conversation had, or maybe just an own conscious choice for himself to maybe pass a bit more. It could also have something to do with the fact that the earlier parts of this game, his passes had been working out quite well, including the primary assist on the Barabanov goal. But he ends up passing up a glorious opportunity to tie this game up, and unfortunately the Sharks would never even get close to another look in the offensive zone, and so the Sharks would indeed lose it 2-1. Moving on to players to talk about, we have the top line of Eklund, Hertl, and Duclair. And to continue the Eklund conversation, besides that missed opportunity in the last 90 or so seconds, 60 seconds even, Eklund actually was perhaps the Sharks' best forward of the night. What is quite interesting is that usually when Eklund has a really good night, his line mate Tomas Hertl is right there alongside him. That's not to say that Eklund is a product of Hertl, but Eklund at this point of his career is not necessarily a player who's able to drive his own line forward, and so he benefits a lot from having a player like Hertl on that line with him. But here tonight was maybe a big step forward for Eklund, because Hertl honestly was kind of mediocre, not exactly super noticeable, a decent game for him, but certainly nothing amazing, and it was Eklund who was pulling all the weight of that first line with multiple great chances set up by himself in the offensive zone. He drew a penalty as well, got the primary assist on the only Sharks goal, and just generally looked all over the ice here tonight. So definitely a big comeback game after a relatively shaky performance the previous game against the Detroit Red Wings. The other player on this line at the start of the game was Anthony Duclair, and while he was not terrible in the offensive zone, he didn't really make anything happen, and as such he would get demoted as the game would go on, and Barabanov, who we'll get to a bit later, got promoted up to this first line. But let us first talk about the second line now of Granlund, Zetterlund, and Hoffman. And for the first time in a couple of games, this was a line that had been previously generating a ton of chances, but here tonight there really wasn't much of anything. Granlund looked okay, but not amazing. Hoffman, I thought, had some decent moves in the offensive zone, but nothing that actually led to some scoring chances. And defensively, I don't think, again, Hoffman was particularly good, and Zetterlund was kind of invisible here tonight. So this second line that has been contributing a lot for the Sharks over this losing streak, one of the lines that's been quite consistent for them over that losing streak, just had a pretty off night, and that could have been definitely the difference maker for why the Sharks couldn't really at least force an overtime here tonight. When it comes to the third line, I have, of course, been very hard on all three of these players over these last few games because they've done essentially nothing. In particular, Kunin and Studnicka have been completely useless for San Jose, but in the positive news here, this was for once a decent game for the third line. Not good, not great, certainly not great, but a decent enough line, because for once they actually had a couple of good offensive zone shifts. Studnicka with a pretty decent shift that got a good chance for Barabanov. Kunin didn't look all that terrible here tonight, and so while it is strictly just average games from these players, that is so much better than the terrible games that they have had previously. I'm not going to say that this is a sort of looking forward that it's going to suddenly become an amazing third line for San Jose, but I guess it's slightly better than usual. One thing that I do want to note in terms of ice time, Studnicka right at the bottom of the entire team with less than 9 minutes of ice time here tonight. So he is, for all intents and purposes, the 12th forward for the San Jose Sharks, and it seemed to just be hanging onto a roster spot by a thread at this point. When it comes to the fourth line, we have, I should actually first of all talk about, of course, Barabanov. He got promoted up to that first line after having a pretty solid first couple of periods for the San Jose Sharks. He immediately did make an impact with that top line with a really good shift, and I don't know if it's something that's going to fully stick for an extended period of time. It's quite clear that Barabanov is just not really on his game thus far this season. Perhaps this is one, since it was technically his best game of the year, even though that's not saying much. Perhaps this is sort of a building block type of game that could get him to that point, and I do think he'll likely get a spot on the top line for the San Jose Sharks going into the next one, just due to a lack of better options. But I'll have to see more from Barabanov before I actually lay heavy praise onto him, even though this was a decent start. Then when it comes to the fourth line, which was very effective in the previous game against Detroit, definitely a small step back here tonight. Carpenter did hit the post at the very least, so it's not as though they had a complete lack of chances here tonight. Bailey continues to show off a certain solid amount of speed in his game, even if it didn't really lead to much here tonight. And Zadina actually got promoted to the third line as Duclair dropped from the first all the way down to the fourth by the end of this game. In fact, he really didn't even get too many shifts by the end of this game. And Zadina on this third line, definitely not nearly as good as he did in the previous one against Detroit, which he just seemed to have that extra gear there just playing against his former team. It was more so relatively average, if not slightly below average here tonight. When it comes defensively, we have the top pairing of Ferraro and Emberson. And just like the previous game against Detroit, this top pairing was again pretty good. Emberson is just a solid defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. He was prior to the injury. He continues to be after returning from the injury. And while he's certainly not like top pairing defensive material for an actual good team, for a Sharks squad that is lacking any decent defenseman, especially with the recent news of Matt Benning having season-ending hip surgery earlier today, Emberson is a big part now of the Sharks' defense, and he's been really filling in that role very, very well. When it comes to Mario Ferraro, he has always been a player who has been willing to give his 110% every single game, but it feels as though he's even stepped that up further. That is not to say that he's been elite and playing at an insanely elite level, but that is to say the effort has increased somehow when it comes to Ferraro, and primarily from an offensive perspective. Ferraro has really taken it upon him, and I've mentioned this multiple times in the past, and it continues to be the case, and because of that, he looks like a much more three-dimensional defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, and I wonder if this perhaps has something to do with the fact that his name is indeed in the trade rumors thus far this season. You know, for a lot of these players, as much as they might, want to be with San Jose, they do kind of also, as NHL players, want to be competitive, want to win games, want to compete for a Stanley Cup. And currently with San Jose, you're not going to do it this season. You may very well not even do it next season or even the year after that. You might be eyeing one of those more competitive teams as a home for yourself. Even if you're going to get slightly less ice time, Ferraro could slot in onto a second pairing of a good team and perhaps win many more games than the Sharks currently are. So perhaps that is a reason for why we have seen a noticeable rise in performance from Ferraro, at the very least a noticeable rise in effort offensively from Mario Ferraro, but it was a solid first pairing night for the San Jose Sharks. When it comes to their second pairing, we have Thrun and Ruda. Now, this was a very good pairing for the Sharks in the previous game against Detroit. Here tonight, a small step back, I would say. Thrun still pretty solid, but a few of those really bad giveaways crept back into his game, something that we had seen in his performances when he was originally called up to the team, kind of returning here tonight a bit. There was this one shift where he had two really bad defensive zone giveaways that led to some decent chances for the Winnipeg Jets, but I would say on the whole, he actually had a pretty good game for San Jose. Ruda slightly behind Thrun, but not by that much, still pretty solid. The third pairing is where we had the most issues for the San Jose Sharks, pretty much as per usual, I would say. Kyle Burroughs out with an injury, but that's not really the end of the world. The interesting thing is that Vlasic gets the game. Now, I don't know if Ahotyuk is injured or if he was just a healthy scratch once again, but I thought he would draw back into the lineup, as I would much prefer, as much as I've sort of ragged on Ahotyuk thus far this season, I much prefer him in the lineup compared to Vlasic, because once again, Vlasic steps in here. He was a healthy scratch for the last few games, I believe so, and so you're maybe hoping for some sort of rebound performance. That didn't exist. He was once again one of the worst defensemen for the San Jose Sharks on the night, though not the worst, because that title is taken by Kalen Addison, as once again we see the flaw of Addison's game. On the one even strength goal that the Jets do end up getting, Addison gets out-muscled in front of the net, gets out-battled in front of the net, and is unable to tie up this player as the Jets tie the game. And how many times have we we mentioned this season, Addison losing a net front battle. It feels as though that's happened at least like a dozen times at this point, and it's just getting tiresome to watch Addison just get beaten in that particular area. Yes, he's not the biggest player. It's hard to necessarily expect him to win a lot of battles, but at some point you do have to be able to defend the front of the net if you are going to be an NHL defenseman, and Addison just not really capable of doing that. And then finally we get to the goaltender for the Sharks, Mackenzie Blackwood. He's struggled as of late for sure. He hasn't played much in the last few games due to illness, but prior to that, his last couple of starts were not particularly good. In fact, I would imagine that his last actual good outing for San Jose was the Sharks' previous matchup against the Jets that he won 2-1, and so he gets the opportunity to once again try and secure the win for San Jose, and he does absolutely the best he possibly could, as he doesn't really have much of a chance on either of these two goals, but unfortunately the goal support is not there, and so Blackwood ends up coming out with the loss. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action in a couple of days on Saturday, where they will head on the road to the East, and they will face off against the Toronto Maple Leafs. Always a tough matchup. An extremely strong offensive team, and we'll see if the Sharks can match their season high losing streak or finally break out of it. Class dismissed.